Hey everyone! So we've covered the Spectre in the Silver and Golden Ages of comic books, and now it's time to move into the Bronze Age, as this character barrels towards his role in the game-changing DC moment of history known as the Crisis of Infinite Earths. Before we get into that, be sure to subscribe to Comic Island for more videos about comic book characters and much more. Following the near collision of Earths 1 and 2, the Spectre's spirit was left nearly destroyed. Long cast out by the Earth 2 version of Jim Corrigan as a result of his punishment by the Presence, the spirit was left confused. It found itself on Earth 1, where it bonded with that world's version of Jim Corrigan. As a result of this experience, the Spectre and Corrigan were for a time convinced they were both native to Earth 1, although years later the truth was eventually discovered by the Spectre. Before that time, the Spectre resumed his crime-fighting ways, but now on a different, new world that up until then had only scant encounters with the spirit. This proved particularly troubling to the criminals who would cross this being's path, as though he may not have remembered his experiences on Earth 2 at first. The growing aggression of the spirit that took place on his final days on that world were still very much present in his new role on Earth 1. In fact, if anything, he had become more violent and deadly than ever before, with a new flair for gruesomeness. One thief was melted into a pile of goo, while another criminal, holding a woman hostage at gunpoint, had his flesh stripped away in an instant. The spirit of vengeance, who would only appear before the criminals he killed, likely in an effort to avoid Corrigan having to deal with the Spectre being a public menace this time around, inadvertently caused people to witness deaths with no apparent cause other than a ghost only the criminals could see, leading to many terrified bystanders. One person who took it all in stride, though, was Jim Corrigan, who worked much better with this more malevolent version of the Spectre than his Earth 2 counterpart ever did. Like on Earth 2, the Earth 1 Jim Corrigan was also a police detective, but this version worked in New York City for the NYPD. This version of Jim was far more accepting of a violent and deadly Spectre, and was happy to cover up and support the ghostly being's wrath, even deploying remarkably glib humor to keep the suspicions of his superiors at the NYPD at a bare minimum. Like his counterpart, he pushed away from romance, readily accepting the goals of the Spectre and focusing on their shared desire for vengeance against criminals more than anything else. Compounding these beliefs were the fact that just as on Earth 2, the Jim Corrigan of Earth 1 was also killed by criminals and only resurrected after the arrival of the Spectre. In spite of Jim's attempts to keep romance out of his life, a wealthy woman named Gwen Sterling did eventually learn about Corrigan's situation after her father's death. Though the two clearly had mutual feelings for one another, Jim consistently kept her at a distance, knowing full well life with the Spectre would inevitably prove dangerous to a civilian. Sure enough, even with Corrigan's efforts to keep Gwen away, she was kidnapped and brainwashed on two separate occasions by two different villains. Both times the Spectre was able to save Gwen and brutally kill the kidnappers, but the danger of being around her was made clear. Yet Gwen was undeterred. When she was later taken hostage by a group of crooks, and yet again the Spectre rescued her, Gwen insisted that Corrigan marry him, in spite of the constant danger and Jim effectively being a corpse of some kind. After all, the Earth 1 version of Corrigan was never revived like he was on Earth 2, and thus, at this time, didn't even need to eat, breathe, or sleep. Jim's behavior at the time reflects someone who didn't even really view himself as truly human anymore. So he gently turned down her proposal, and they departed, seemingly for the final time. But this event seemed to change Jim's view of the Spectre, and left him resentful of his fate for the first time. He called out to the Presence, pleading for the chance to marry Gwen and be freed from the Spectre's mission. Unknown to Corrigan, the Presence assented to this request and returned him to life. The next day, he felt strange but thought nothing of it until the man was shot on the job. As a result, another officer was killed, and Jim was rushed to the hospital, barely surviving himself. Nevertheless, he was delighted to find himself free from the Spectre, mortal once more. Within days, Jim was engaged to Gwen. However, hearing of this news, notorious criminal Ducky McLaren arranged a trap to kill Corrigan in retaliation for him arresting one of his gang. Corrigan was brutally gunned down even after he tried to use one of the gang members as a human shield, with the rest of the gang coldly mowing both men down in response to their companion being taken hostage. They took Corrigan's corpse and left it crudely propped up against Gwen's door for her to discover. After his funeral, Jim was brought before the Presence, which stated he was destined to remain on Earth, bound to the Spectre, implying this would always happen to Corrigan in any life, no matter how many times he was revived, perhaps on any world. Though Corrigan wanted eternal rest instead, his desires were ignored by the Presence, and on Earth, the Spectre rose once more. He immediately slaughtered Ducky and his gang, then briefly appeared before Gwen, warning her that while the world would believe that Jim Corrigan was mistakenly thought dead and buried alive, he assured her this was not the truth, and that he was dead once more. They would not be able to get married after all. Around this time, Jim Corrigan also had an encounter with mild-mannered reporter Clark Kent. They worked together to battle two criminals called the Grandettis, though during this adventure, Kent was disgusted at the Spectre's violent behavior. The reporter was unaware that Corrigan was really the Spectre all along, and the police detective managed to keep it that way, even against the observant Clark Kent. The two successfully worked together to defeat the crooks, though the man secretly known as Superman was unable to stop the Spectre from killing them both. The experience left the reporter shaken, as the Spectre was too fast and powerful for him to even appear as Superman and confront the being. Jim Corrigan next came in conflict with a journalist named Earl Crawford. While most of the public remained oblivious to the Spectre, Crawford became convinced of the spirit's existence. He started a crusade to prove to the world that the Spectre was real, which ultimately just led him to an insane asylum. Both Corrigan and Gwen Sterling felt terrible about this, knowing full well that Earl was telling the truth. Earl eventually escaped thanks to Gwen, who, wearing a disguise, gave the man a knife so he could pry a window open and flee the asylum. Eventually, Earl did discover it was Gwen who helped him and became suspicious of her having some sort of connection to the Spectre. But ultimately nothing came of it. Earl's investigation went cold, and fearing for his safety, he abandoned any thoughts of looking into the Spectre again in the future. Perhaps sensing the situation was getting out of control and kept hurting people like Gwen and Earl, Jim Corrigan and the Spectre cut ties with Gwen for good, never contacting her again. He remained on staff at the NYPD, by then having earned the reputation as New York's toughest cop. Sometime later, Corrigan visited Gotham City, hot on the trail of a salesman who seemingly was on a spree of strangling people without any apparent pattern. There, the Spectre was reunited with Batman, an old friend of the spirit and someone even this version of Jim Corrigan had come to know and trust. Corrigan and the Spectre had come to suspect that Weaver was somehow involved with the former cult of assassins from India known as the Thugs, and they were intent on bringing him to justice. These people thought to kill through strangulation, but were supposedly wiped out in the 1830s by the British Army. As the Spectre, Corrigan was able to track down Weaver, who he found stealing a pickaxe from a graveyard. The powerful ghostly being was easily able to subdue Weaver, but in his rage, he destroyed the pickaxe. This confirmed to Corrigan that the cult was involved, since the pickaxe was used in one of their rituals. However, when he took the criminal into GCPD custody, Corrigan was unable to produce further evidence since the pickaxe was destroyed, and the Gotham police were forced to let Weaver go, outraging Police Commissioner James Gordon at the apparent incompetence of Jim Corrigan. Though Batman was initially skeptical of the cult's involvement, he became convinced that Corrigan was onto something, and began tailing Weaver, only for the detective to get ambushed by the criminal and shot at 3 times at point-blank range. Luckily, the Spectre arrived just in time, using his magic to turn the bullets into butterflies and Weaver's gun into a spider, horrifying the criminal in the process. Yet Weaver refused to reveal more under interrogation, and further investigation began turning up bizarre evidence that implicated a Gotham police detective in one of the strangulations. Teaming up, the Spectre and Batman eventually deduced that Weaver and this detective were involved in a group called the Dirty Dozers, soldiers stationed in the China-Burma-India theater during World War II. So the Spectre used his powers to peer back into the past, where he witnessed these soldiers become possessed after they destroyed the burial site of the original thugs. None of them were aware of the possession, which sat dormant for around 24 years until it took control of them back in America. Batman and the Spectre were able to end this and free the soldiers by destroying a statue of the Indian god Kali, which empowered the assassins. When informed of what happened, the soldiers were devastated at their own actions, having been completely unaware of these crimes even once the possession took hold. They turned themselves in willingly, and Batman took comfort in the fact that the courts were willing to acknowledge the unusual circumstances of these crimes, showing leniency towards these honorable men. The Spectre's next major encounter was with a paranormal investigator named Dr. Terrence 13, who the ghostly hero saved from a group of terrorists. Dr. 13, a skeptic who had long fought for justice while debunking supposed ghosts, was on the verge of quitting his role as a self-referred ghostbreaker, was alarmed by the Spectre brutally liquefying the terrorists in plain view of the skeptic. This was an unusual move by the spirit, who by then had taken to appearing invisible to normal civilians. And sure enough, it left Dr. 13 outraged and taken by this immoral behavior. The police, led by Jim Corrigan, appeared not to believe Dr. 13's story, even with witnesses, as Dr. 13 couldn't have possibly known the true identity of Corrigan at the time. So as a result, the paranormal investigator realized he'd have to take matters into his own hands, believing the Spectre to be some sort of illusion and intent on proving as such. Dr. 13 then met Earl Crawford, a man who nearly lost everything investigating the Spectre earlier. Earl had long given up further pursuing the Spectre, instead interested in ties a criminal may have had with Dr. 13's father, and the two agreed to focus on the latter mystery. As a result, they were both nearly killed by a criminal named Daryl Sontag, revealed to have been the murderer of Dr. 13's father. The Spectre then appeared before them, and in front of a baffled 13 and Crawford, the spirit forced Sontag to shoot himself in the head. Once again, the Spectre vanished before their very eyes. This time, however, when Jim Corrigan once again was the officer responding to the incident, both Crawford and 13 became suspicious of the detective's connection to the Spectre, based on his response to their story. Earl refused to involve himself any further, completely terrified of the Spectre at this point, and no longer wanting to encounter the spirit ever again. Dr. 13, however, a longtime skeptic of spiritual phenomenon being real, and absolutely determined to bring Corrigan to justice and learn the true nature of the Spectre, refused to give up. He began trailing Jim and even witnessed the police lieutenant slip away from sight just as the Spectre appeared to violently kill more criminals. When Dr. 13 confronted the Spectre over this, with his body on the verge of death, Terrence woke up in a spirit realm, and the Spectre spoke to him. Ever the skeptic, 13 insisted this was all some dream concocted by his dying brain. Regardless, the Spectre summoned the spirit of Terrence's father. This stunned Dr. 13, but he recovered enough such that father and son were able to share some kind words with each other. Although Terrence initially believed that he very well was speaking to his father's spirit at first, he suddenly declared that though he was almost convinced, this must have just been some sort of near-death experience like he initially thought. After this, Dr. 13 was promptly returned to life, apparently recovering miraculously from the gunshot wound. His faith and skepticism shaken, but far from broken, he vowed to continue his quest for answers about the paranormal, now certain of his future as a ghost breaker. Back in the spirit realm, the Spectre spoke to Terrence's father, explaining that he allowed himself to be seen by Dr. 13 so that Terrence would renew his commitment to breaking ghosts and seeking justice for victims of them. Not long after this, the Spectre came across an ancient wizard named Warzen from feudal Japan. As he battled the wizard, the spirit reunited with Batman, who was pursuing the powerful god that commanded tremendous dark magic and had already killed a man in Gotham after an artifact delivered there summoned the evil wizard. For the first time since his arrival on Earth-1, the Spectre's powers were truly put to the test against a formidable force of magic. Still, the Spectre was unmatched in strength, and the wizard only managed to escape the Spectre's wrath by attacking Batman and forcing the spirit to diverge his attention. This made Batman furious at himself for not just letting the Spectre handle things on its own, but the spirit remained focused on hunting Warzen. Thanks to the spirit's profound occult knowledge, it knew exactly where the wizard fled to. Modern Japan, where he would be able to restore his powers to full and create a cult worshipping an ancient dragon god, from which Warzen drew his power. Luckily, the heroes were able to arrive in time, allowing Batman to provide a distraction while the Spectre moved in and attempted an ambush. But Warzend saw through the ploy and attacked them both fiercely. The Wizard and the Spectre had a cataclysmic battle, ranging from realms so small they existed on a subatomic level to those that existed entirely on the astral plane and far beyond. With Warzend now in Japan, he could tap into the Dragon God's powers like never before, and the Spectre was nearly obliterated as a result. Just as the Wizard was about to finish him off, a well-timed Batarang managed to destroy the artifact that originally summoned Warzend to Gotham City, destroying the ancient wizard once and for all. The Spectre was extremely grateful for Batman, as the spirit was certain he would have been destroyed were it not for the Caped Crusader, and it promised to one day repay the hero. As the Spectre left, Batman debated with himself about whether or not a being like the Spectre could ever really be killed. The Caped Crusader thought to himself how he certainly didn't envy the strange life of the Spectre. Not long after this, Jim Corrigan found himself taking a train to Gateway City, where he had decided to relocate. The train was nearly derailed, save for only the legendary power of the Spectre. However, while the spirit was vacant of Corrigan's body, the police lieutenant was kidnapped. When the Spectre returned to recharge his spiritual energy, he was unable to find Corrigan, as some sort of spell broke the link between these two beings, which would normally allow the spirit to trace his body. Panicking for a moment, the Spectre decided he needed the help of the world's greatest detective to solve this mystery, and sought him out in Gotham City. Batman agreed to help, and so the Spectre traveled back in time with the Caped Crusader, to the moment he discovered Jim Corrigan's disappearance. They found a trail showing Jim was taken off the train and put onto a truck, but during this search, Batman noted the Spectre was increasingly outraged about the crime. It became clear by this point that the Caped Crusader had become wary of the spirit's growing violent tendencies throughout the world, and Batman was well aware he'd be powerless to stop the Spectre from slaughtering the kidnappers on sight. It was revealed Corrigan was taken because of his unique status as an undead vessel for a spirit. An immortal woman named Kalindra used magic to infuse the spirit of her long-dead lover into Corrigan's body because of this. Just as she completed the soul transfer, the Spectre appeared, with him and Batman quickly dispatching Kalindra's minions. Confronting her and her lover, a man named Stephos, the Spectre did battle with them on the astral plane. Stephos, who had been banished there for centuries, proved a deadly threat as he had learned to reshape his body on this realm of existence to whatever form he saw fit, while the Spectre remained weakened being apart from Corrigan so long. The Spectre was only able to win by siphoning some of Batman's spirit, as it had the power of a good soul behind it, even if it was troubled by evil. With that, the Spectre was able to force Stephos back into the mortal realm and blast both him and Kalindra into oblivion, in spite of Batman's protests. The Spectre attempted to justify his actions to Batman, explaining that those two souls lived for a very long time, and they deserved to move on. He even showed Batman a vision of the two reunited in the afterlife. The Spirit later became involved in a gambit where two groups of villains from both Earths 1 and 2 teamed up to defeat the superheroes of both worlds. During this adventure, the latest iteration of the Justice Society of America was approached by Sargon the Sorcerer, a being like the Spectre whose origins could be traced back to Earth 2, but had come to live on Earth 1. Sargon explained the nature of the Spectre as a being of Earth 2 contained entirely in Jim Corrigan's body from Earth 1, but Jim was blasted by the Spectre's old teammate from the Justice Society, the Thunderbolt, at the behest of an old enemy, the Earth 1 version of Johnny Thunder. Because of this, the Spectre was largely out of commission for this particular crisis. It was only after the spell on Corrigan was broken following the defeat of the evil version of Johnny Thunder that the Spectre was freed. In the blink of an eye, the Spectre brought Superman to the scene, saving the day and helping both Black Canary and the Spectre better understand their nature of immigrants of sorts from Earth 2, now at home on Earth 1. The Spectre began to fully reconcile with his original existence of that world, and as a result, old, previously unknown memories began to resurface of his time during World War II, involving his work on the JSA. With a host of new memories of his time with the JSA flooding in, back from his days on Earth 2, the Spectre of the present on Earth 1 decided for a time to go dormant. traveling to the realms of heaven and reflecting on the past. He remembered how he and others in the JSA were revealed to have been captured during World War II by a group of villains led by a man calling himself Zatanna. This led to the formation of another superhero team called the All-Star Squadron, who rescued the JSA. The Spectre would help out this new hero team and the JSA on occasion before his first disappearance back in the 1940s. That included a prolonged battle with a particularly menacing, powerful being called Kulak, who took control of the Spectre and used him to mount a near-successful invasion of Earth 2. The spirit became a temporary thrall of Kulak, having lost the Ring of Life and Death he once used in the Golden Age to prevent stuff like this from happening, until the heroes of Earth 2 ultimately prevailed against Kulak, with the powerful mystic Dr. Fate able to save the Spectre from Kulak's control. Following this, the Spectre was invited to become part of the All-Star Squadron. Early into his inauguration, he was involved in events surrounding another Earth called Earth X. This world was on the eve of a devastating attack in their Second World War, so Spectre tried to help by returning a number of heroes from that world who had found themselves stranded on Earth 2. They were stopped by the presence, however, as at this time it was uncomfortable with him using powers on another Earth, only wanting the being to operate on worlds where the spirit had resurrected Jim Corrigan. The Spectre could only watch the resulting struggle on Earth X from a distance as a result, but the rest of the All-Star Squadron was able to help out. As for the Spectre, he was left trapped in the realm between worlds, and in his attempt to escape, he discovered Earth X and Earth 2 were set to collide. The Spectre was forced to hold the worlds apart, while the heroes of Earth X, known as the Freedom Fighters, agreed to split themselves across the worlds to prevent the collision, after a number of Nazis crossed over between the two worlds, setting these events into motion because it created an unbalance between these worlds. This appears to have been the first crisis of any kind that the Spectre or citizens of Earth 2 had ever experienced. Though, as documented during the Silver Age, this was hardly the last time the Spectre would deal with a crisis, or even physically hold two worlds apart in this strange realm between universes. It was the greatest crisis reality had ever known. World after world suddenly found itself at the mercy of a being from a dark realm called the Antimatter Universe. That being's name was the Anti-Monitor, and he would not rest until every reality but his was destroyed. It was a time that would test the mettle of every superhero known to ever exist by that point, including the Spectre himself. It was the crisis of Infinite Earths. Through extensive testing and planning, two beings stood at the forefront of opposing the Anti-Monitor. First was the Anti-Monitor's regular matter counterpart, the Monitor, and second was his apprentice, a woman named Lila, also known as Harbinger. The test of the Spectre and the JSA in the 1940s back on Earth 2 was one of many this duo conducted across the multiverse and the timeline, all with the goal of determining which heroes would better serve in the battle to save all of reality. Because of these tests and plans, it was decided not to involve the Spectre early on in the days of the Crisis of Infinite Earths, unlike many other superheroes. In fact, he seemed to have been kept largely unaware of these events until it was far too late for the Spirit to do much to stop reality from falling apart. In spite of many various attempts by these other superheroes initially drafted into the fray, the Anti-Monitor moved with devastating speed, destroying all but 5 universes, each of which were left hanging by a thread. The final 5 remaining Earths drifted together, doomed to collide in an event that would end everything known to exist in the realms of matter. It was only at this point that the Spectre was brought in to help with the crisis, along with a legion of other superheroes from across the multiverse. Though in the past, where a crisis might only involve 2 or 3 universes vying for survival, and the Spectre was usually the most powerful weapon available to any of those individual worlds involved. Here, in the Crisis of Infinite Earths, the Spectre was practically useless. Just like the ghostly being's last encounter with a creature from the Antimatter universe, the Spectre and his magic were largely inert against the Anti-Monitor and his wave of destructive antimatter that was wiping out regular reality. It was only after one of Spectre's friends from Earth 1, Barry Allen, sacrificed himself to destroy the Anti-Monitor's antimatter cannon that the Spectre was finally able to act. With the cannon's antimatter energies dissipated in the regular universe, the Spirit's phenomenal powers returned in full. Unfortunately, these powers came at a time when all they could really do was inform the hero how dire their situation had become. The loss of the antimatter weapon had stalled the Anti-Monitor's plans, but hardly halted the being himself. And even as things stood, they were all doomed. The Spectre let a cry of frustration out, with his full power reverberating throughout the dwindling remnants of reality. The multiverse had fallen, and the most powerful superhero who had ever lived was never given the opportunity to try and stop it. His frustration was understandable, compounded even further by the fact that the surviving heroes and villains were at the time unaware that the Anti-Monitor was still alive and keen on destroying all of reality. The Spectre came upon these mortals battling each other over the surviving scraps of existence, and quickly put this to a halt. He rallied both sides to his cause, explaining that the Anti-Monitor traveled back in time and planned to strike down the multiverse at the time of its birth. However, the good news was it gave those of the regular matter universe a rare opportunity, as it was at the dawn of time that the Anti-Monitor was spawned into this existence as well. At the Spectre's advice, hero and villain alike agreed to work together on a plan that would not only save reality, but potentially undo the Anti-Monitor's actions before they even began. Unfortunately, the villains failed to live up to their end of the plan. The Anti-Monitor's creation happened uninterrupted, while the villainous being arrived and prepared to strike down all of existence in one fell blow. In this critical moment, it was only the Spectre who was able to stand against the Anti-Monitor. These two beings entered into an epic cosmic struggle as the birth of the multiverse raged around them. Other magical superheroes like Dr. Fate lent the Spectre their combined strength, but also got the impression that this had virtually no effect on a struggle between beings this powerful over energies this primordial. This pivotal moment ended in a cataclysmic explosion that would forever define the history of the Spectre and the multiverse around him. Though heroes and villains of matter failed to stop or undo the actions of the Anti-Monitor, a single precious world and universe around it survived this apocalypse thanks to the Spectre. Where there had once been infinite worlds, now there was one. But on the other hand, where there once stood to be nothingness, instead, matter, existence, and life prevailed over nothingness. And though it was all thanks to the Spectre, he cannot be credited with bringing the crisis to a true end. For this battle left the Spectre comatose and unresponsive, while the Anti-Monitor survived, and was prepared to strike down this final universe. Luckily, a number of other superheroes, and even some surviving villains, all worked together to bring the Anti-Monitor down once and for all. Though the Spectre was unable to regain consciousness for this final battle, he still proved vital in this victory, as the superheroes were able to tap into his celestial energies, aiding in this final fight. The Spectre proved invaluable in saving reality, but it was only a small drop of life compared to what was once an infinite ocean of existence. The costs were dire, and for many, it meant major changes to their life and history that would take place as they learned to live on this new Earth. Meant to be a rough amalgamation of the many variations of the planet that had once existed. This world largely resembled Earth 1, but with elements from other worlds, particularly the history of Earth 2, incorporated into it. For a being like the Spectre, an Earth 2 being who had been living on Earth 1 for some time, these changes were minimal at first. For many of his old friends at the JSA and other natives of Earth 2, these changes would be unsettling and far deeper, as these heroes suddenly felt redundant and unneeded relative to Earth 1's much younger Justice League of America. With the JSA's numbers dwindling and now, in the wake of a crisis at an all-time low, the heroes of this group were left feeling a sense of despair. They unanimously agreed to disband the Justice Society once and for all, with most members set to retire. Just as they were about to make that decision final, a disheveled version of the Spectre approached the team. While the baffled Dr. Fate wondered how the most powerful being of the higher cosmos could be laid waste like this, the Spirit spoke out, claiming to be the universe itself and that they were all dying. With that, he collapsed in the Sorcerer's arms. The alarm team was unable to wake the Spectre, nor could they detect a pulse on him, but they were familiar enough with his nature to know that a lack of a pulse is a pretty normal thing for this superhero. The Spectre stirred and managed to show Dr. Fate a vision before vanishing, having done what he had traveled billions of miles to do. He then exploded in a furious display of spiritual energy. Dr. Fate shared his vision he received from the Spectre with the rest of the team, of a past adventure the group was involved in back in 1945. Then, while attending the funeral of FDR, the team saw the sky itself being torn apart. The Spectre was able to determine the cause of this phenomenon was from Berlin, and the heroes raced off to learn what was happening. The team discovered this was the doing of none other than Hitler himself, who had found a powerful magical artifact called the Spear of Destiny. The JSA was then confused to see the outcome of the story that had supposedly happened in the past. The Fuhrer was able to wield the spear and destroy not just the JSA, but the entire Earth. Obviously, nobody on the team remembered such an event happening, nor did it make any sense to them. But it seemed as though reality was catching up to the story itself, as in the present day, the sky too was being torn asunder, and it fit with the Spectre's story of all of reality falling apart around them. To resolve this, the JSA was able to travel back in time courtesy of Dr. Fate, and they were able to resolve this paradox, though many among them fell in the process in this deadly mission, as Nazis were able to summon beings of Norse mythology. Though the surviving JSA members prevailed against both the forces of Valhalla and the Third Reich, the powerful demon of fire Surtur stood ready to finish off the rest of the JSA. However, Dr. Fate was able to call upon the Spectre's powers, as the spiritual superhero had always existed largely out of the normal framework of time. Using that power, Fate was able to restore the JSA, defeat Surtur, and restore the timeline as it once was, though it left the sorcerer imprisoned in Valhalla. The Spectre then appeared before Dr. Fate, explaining that he shared his powers with the sorcerer to ensure all this would happen. They talked about the Spectre's battle against the darkness in heaven, which apparently involved only a small amount of the being's true power, compared to the full extent of his abilities shown in the Crisis of Infinite Earths. Claiming he would now vanish from all of mankind's history, the Spectre brought Dr. Fate back to the real world with the others, before allegedly disappearing from existence once and for all. However, the Spectre would be wrong about this. Both him and Jim Corrigan would find themselves on a new world, with new rules, new origins, and a new history to contend with. On this new Earth, the Spectre was remade, initially with an updated version of his history, taking place in 1940, where he was still part of the JSA. But eventually with a version of Jim Corrigan that largely represented his history of both Earths 1 and 2. And on this new world, there was plenty of vengeance for both men to inflict on evildoers. While dwelling on these memories, the Spectre was suddenly woken in the present day. The Phantom Stranger and the Swamp Thing had appeared before him, at the edges of heaven. The Spectre recognized both these beings, as the Phantom Stranger was a uniquely immortal celestial being, with untold power and implied to be on a level comparable to the Presence, the godlike entity that had created the Spectre to begin with. Though this was the first time the Spectre had ever met this version of the Swamp Thing, he was familiar with the nature of him as an earth elemental, empowered by the embodiment of plant life itself known as the Green. That being said, the Spectre was surprised to learn that a creature still existed in the modern world of man. The Spectre was called upon by these individuals at the borders of heaven, seeking permission from him, as a being that represents the Presence, to allow the two passage into hell, so that they could free a soul sent there unjustly named Abigail Crane. The Spectre initially refused this offer, arguing that if the woman was sent to hell, then she should remain there. The Phantom Stranger pointed out that she was sent there by a villain named Anton Arcane, and the Spectre conceded that she probably should be saved, or else hell wouldn't really mean anything as a punishment to wicked souls, though he refused to allow them to return her to life, since that would in turn render the cycle of birth and death meaningless. To that, the Phantom Stranger simply asked of Jim Corrigan. With a mighty laugh, the Spectre was impressed by the cleverness of the stranger, going so far as to call the stranger his favorite among the presences. He granted them both entry into hell. Both the Phantom Stranger and the Swamp Thing would again see the Spectre not long after this. A great and powerful force had been unleashed on Earth, referred to only as the Darkness, the embodiment of nothingness and evil. It was prepared to overtake all of life and beyond, eventually destroying even the realms of heaven and hell. In response, the forces of these two celestial domains united in an unprecedented move to take on this powerful being. But it was to no avail. Elite demons, including the famous Etrigan, fell before the might of the darkness, leading to hordes of hell fleeing the battle, while angels such as Metatron and hosts of the Throne of the Presence itself were wiped out as if they were nothing. The Spectre was used as heaven's last resort, standing before the darkness and challenging the greatest foe this spiritual superhero had ever faced to date. Though the Spectre, unlike the other celestial beings, was able to match the enormous scale of the darkness, this force of apparent evil was able to completely envelop the spirit. The darkness spoke out to the celestial being, asking him about the nature of evil itself. The Spectre stated that evil exists to be avenged, so that others can learn to follow the will of good out of fear of the retribution they might face. A typical answer for the Spectre, but the darkness, who felt punished by the existence of light over the eons for no particular reason other than it simply existing, found this answer wholly unsatisfying, even frustrating, and so it cast the Spectre out. Seeing a being as mighty as the Spectre fall to the power of this entity was enough to leave the combined forces of heaven, hell, and earth resigned to losing this conflict to the darkness, as the Spectre was considered the most powerful among them, willing to act. At this moment, only the Swamp Thing remained to stand his ground, and enter the darkness of his own free will, resigned to the fact that nothing could defeat this being, so he might as well speak to it with humility. Inside, he admitted he did not understand the nature of evil. When he asked the Parliament of Trees about it before, beings who represent the power of the green and past earth elementals, the Parliament told him that evil was not real. This confused Swamp Thing at first, but the Parliament went on to speak of the life cycle, of how plants are consumed by the naturalistic and savage nature of animals, who in turn consume each other and eventually decay to create new plants, and asked the Swamp Thing where the evil was in such a design. Swamp Thing considered that and decided that evil represented the decay and rot, while virtue is the life that grows stronger out of it. To this wisdom, the darkness accepted the answer, and where the Spectre and many others had fallen, Swamp Thing emerged from the darkness unscathed. With that, the presence itself emerged from the throne of heaven and reached out a golden hand to the darkness. They made contact, not out of conflict, but of friendship, and united in a moment of balance, bringing a sudden end to this war. The Spectre left the survivors and witnesses of this event to contemplate its meaning, disappearing entirely. The Phantom Stranger believes this may have shifted the dynamics of reality slightly, perhaps explaining how and why the age of relatively simple notions of superheroes and villains battling one another gave way to increasingly more complex and nuanced notions of these conflicts on Earth around this time. These events did lead to some changes in the history of the Spectre. Though much of his core history remained the same, the origins of the Justice Society, some of their adventures as a team, and the details of how they eventually disbanded in the early 1950s were all slightly updated. Most significantly, the Spectre in the JSA's time, when they were still captured and launched by rockets into space by the Nazis, was altered entirely thanks to the intervention of two beings called the Monitor and Harbinger. The rockets accidentally sent the Spectre and the other superheroes into a realm called hyperdimensional space. There, the Spectre had an adventure similar to the one he did originally, and in the end the team was still brought back together and returned to strike a blow against the Third Reich by capturing the man who built the rockets to begin with. Though this time around, the Spectre could sense the Harbinger was involved in these events, he did not understand or confront her over her actions. Nor was he privy to the details of why she and the Monitor got involved with these events to begin with. This woman, once named Lila Michaels, now called Harbinger, was bestowed phenomenal powers and tremendous abilities by the Monitor, and he made her his apprentice as the two began to test superheroes across the multiverse and throughout time. Though the changes to the timeline concerning the Justice League were a bit accidental on her part, the Monitor very much intentionally gave the Nazis rockets capable of hyperdimensional spaceflight, and they did so because the Monitor knew something few others did, that all of reality was about to face a threat unlike any ever faced before, a crisis not just affecting 2 or 3 alternate universes, but the sprawling, endless multiverse itself. Infinity was on the brink of extinction. In the present day, the Spectre returned to Earth 2 after he was outraged to learn that his former team, the Justice Society of America, was accused of treason after the Batman of Earth 2 was killed and left behind a will implicating the team in helping the Third Reich. The Spectre appeared before the trial investigating this matter and offered to destroy this world, take the JSA elsewhere where they would be better appreciated, and leave all this behind them. But the team unanimously refused this violent offer, intent on proving their loyalty to America through the trial. Though American authorities tried to make the Spectre answer to these charges of treason as well, the Spectre found the idea of human authorities attempting to contain or control him amusing, and he vanished before their eyes, disappearing from the present day entirely. In the wake of the crisis of infinite Earths, and the war between heaven and hell, the Spectre had failed to prevent the chaos surrounding these events, leading other heroes to step in. This did not please the creator of the Spectre, an entity called the Presence. It had already been questioning the value of the being, and had previously punished it a few times back when it was still operating on Earth 2. As such, the Spectre was rendered as dead, or perhaps at least as much of a death as a being like it could experience at the time. He was rendered dormant, and his body was transported to a realm where it could sit inactive, even though the Spectre never truly lived to begin with. In this realm, it is possible the Spectre was existing in his natural form and size as a cosmic entity. It would fit well with the scale of the Spectre's true power as we know it. Yet even so, that scale is very difficult to consider. For example, at this time, the Spectre's eyes were 23 light years apart. As for the newly created amalgamated Earth born out of the crisis, Jim Corrigan was still considered missing in action, unofficially having disappeared during some undercover work. One of his friends, a detective Lou Petrocchi, decided to quietly look into the matter when the police refused to pursue these events further. While this was happening, the Presence reached out to the Spectre. It acknowledged that the Spectre's punishment as it stood made him useless, and wasn't entirely fair either. Paradoxically, the Spectre was so powerful, it was difficult to make use of that power without destroying the vast swaths of the cosmos he was supposed to protect. It decided to change the form of this punishment and cast him out from this unknowable realm. The Presence spoke of the Spectre's role thus far, providing a lot of context for his actions up to and beyond the crisis of infinite Earths. The Spectre was to become an agent to aid in the passage of spirits into heaven and hell, but mostly as a vessel of vengeance for souls killed before they were intended to die. Spirits born through murder and trauma must be avenged, or they will just suffer on Earth for all eternity. This seems to largely have been the purpose of the Spectre to begin with, but he often inflicted a disproportionate and inconsistent amount of wrath on criminals during his existence, perhaps as he was navigating concerns around human standards and conflict, especially with the Earth 2 version of Jim Corrigan, who was a lot more deferential to due process and increasingly fought with the Spectre while they were bonded. So the Spectre would return, but with two conditions. One, it could only punish those who truly and actually deserved it, and two, his wrath must be worthy of the crimes committed, such that only the truly vile would suffer. With that, the spirit was returned to life, as it were, though his powers were heavily pared down, making him only the most powerful ghost on Earth. That's still a considerable level of power, certainly, but a far cry from the being that went toe-to-toe with the Anti-Monitor, or the embodiment of evil itself. In both cases, largely able to stand his ground against beings, even if he ultimately failed against both entities. The Spectre was then sent to Earth in a vortex of screaming souls that died during the war against the darkness and the Anti-Monitor, towards the body of Jim Corrigan. The final aspect of this new punishment would leave the Spectre spiritually tethered to this mortal on a level not seen before. And with that, on the new Earth, the Spectre was reborn. He woke in the home of Madame Xanadu, a powerful and benevolent fortune-teller living in New York, who managed to procure Jim Corrigan's body just before the resurrection. Xanadu was assisted by Kim Liang, a young woman who was co-opted into the fortune-teller's service. Her presence caused the Spectre to immediately spring forth from Corrigan, and the separation caused Jim Corrigan a great deal of pain, unlike before. While the Spectre barked out an ambiguous warning at Kim, Madame Xanadu explained that the pain was going to happen now that the bond between the Spectre and Jim Corrigan had changed in nature. The Spectre leaving their shared body would always make Jim Corrigan weaker. However, the pain over time would subside. Xanadu seemed to know the Spectre well and explained Kim would be their new assistant. prompting the spirit to calm down and return to Jim Corrigan's body. Corrigan collected Kim's unconscious body after she fainted due to all of this supernatural business being quite new to her, and Madame Xanadu led them to Jim's new office, where he could work as a private detective, with Xanadu having even set him up with a legal license to do so. All of this was arranged by the fortune teller herself, though she insisted her help for these two would largely be more spiritual in nature as a sort of guide. Now set up with a new life, at first Jim Corrigan struggled to adapt to this new occupation as a private detective. This is true even though this is an amalgamated Jim Corrigan, combined of various versions of the Jim Corrigans that once existed across the multiverse. And as such, his personality had changed quite a bit into one more thoughtful, but also quirky. It was made worse by business being slow immediately upon his return. With him being a changed man recently returned to life, few connections surviving his disappearance, all Corrigan could really do was rely on advertising in the yellow pages and hoping people would just show up in his office. Meanwhile, the man became more haunted with nightmares and visions, even hearing sounds of scratching from inside the walls of Madame Xanadu's home. Pretty soon, the Spectre discovered that, now reduced in power, he could no longer possess living things, only inanimate objects or those who have passed away. As before, when separated for long periods of time, the Spectre would grow weaker, but with their increased bond, the terms of this were much more explicit and severe. Now, not only would separation affect Corrigan, but if they did so for longer than 2 days, Jim would die for good, and the Spectre would apparently disintegrate into nothing. Kim Liang was explicitly recruited and mentally prepared through Xanadu's magic to be the guard who would look over Jim Corrigan's body when separated, protecting it if he lost consciousness, and thus the Spectre in the process. Hence the spirit's interest in her when they first met, and her relative ability to take the supernatural events around her in stride, in spite of her initially fainting. Of course, so many changes altered the nature of the relationship between Spectre and his host, which became much more personable as the Spectre had to address to existence and much more resembled a mortal being like Corrigan. Though a power struggle remained between the two parties, the dynamic behind it changed quite a bit. Both parties needed each other, but were perfectly able to operate on their own. The Spectre could very much come and go as he pleased without Corrigan having much control over it, but Corrigan could do whatever he wanted without the Spectre being able to stop him. This led to the two fighting, based on a conflict that had already been brewing in the years leading up to the crisis between the Spectre and the past versions of Jim Corrigan. Interestingly, for the first time, this version of Corrigan also brought up concern of how they were treating these criminals. He started arguing about the justice in punishing those who were often as much victims as those they killed, especially when people were possessed by supernatural entities. This only served to offend the spirit, leading to a prolonged fight where the two didn't even speak to each other for a while. Worse still, the contentious relationship put both in danger, as it spurred Corrigan to often investigate cases on his own when the Spectre was recharging or absent, which left both of them very vulnerable. If Corrigan were to have ever died during this time, it could have meant the permanent end of the Spectre. Meanwhile, a cabal of Satanists known as the Cult of the Blood Red Moon detected the resurrection, and knew this presented them with an opportunity. They arranged for the capture of Lou Petrocchi, Jim's friend, who was possessed by an imp that began forcing the detective to kill various targets on behalf of the cult, who in turn worshipped the demonic being. The Spectre caught wind of this and began tracking the detective down, while Corrigan became involved with a murder when a woman connected to the cult was killed by a giant eagle that burst into his own office and ripped the young lady's heart out. This was considered extremely suspicious to the police, given Jim's earlier disappearance, and he was left a prime suspect, until another similar murder gave the police the sense something bigger was going on. Jim and the Spectre eventually worked together and discovered that these crimes were all linked and part of a massive plan on behalf of the cult. Corrigan wanted to help his friend Lou, but the Spectre had deduced the cult was aiming to bond Lou with the imp in such a way that they would become a symbiotic being that would exist as a sort of evil counterpart to the Spectre and Corrigan, and in the creation of this being would have killed the heroes in the process. So the Spectre, in spite of Jim's protests, managed to track down and kill Lou before he bonded with the imp, but had to let the demonic being and the cult escape in order to save Corrigan from a bunch of strange monsters that had been quietly smuggled into his office by the cult, who disguised the monsters' eggs as gumballs, and they eventually grew into the walls, hence all the scratching noises he heard earlier. Corrigan actually witnessed these monsters earlier, but failed to warn the Spectre due to being distracted by the whole incident with the giant eagle. This made the ghostly being furious, punching out the former detective. When Liang tried to help her employer, Jim made a move towards her, leading them to kiss. A romance soon developed between the PI and his assistant, with both bonding over having been used by supernatural entities and rendered implacable in the face of events no matter how terrifying or dangerous they may be. This then spurred the couple to ask Madame Xanadu why she recruited Kim to begin with, and went to such great efforts to help the Spectre on an ongoing basis. The fortune teller explained that the changes to the spirit could make him become more dangerous, and she wanted to serve as a guide to keep his more violent instincts under control. And so, under this new dynamic, the group began tracking down killers and other supernatural threats. The first case after the cult involved successfully stopping the Liqueur killer, a serial murderer who targeted young women and decorated their corpses in clown makeup. Following that case, memories began to stir of events leading up to Corrigan's disappearance, death, and the storage of his body in a strange vase that kept it preserved until the Spectre's return. After some research into red mist that was killing people in New York, Xanadu revealed that in the final days of the crisis, a woman named Gina killed Corrigan after she was possessed by the red mist. The fortune teller had Corrigan's body quietly sealed away after that happened, knowing it would be important again in the future, assuming the crisis of Infinite Earths didn't destroy all of reality. This led to the discovery that the red mist was another spirit, though much more malevolent than the Spectre, as it was fueled by the cataclysmic energies from the crisis of Infinite Earths. The mist soon found itself in conflict with the Spectre, but fled the being and trapped the spirit by attempting to knock down a building in New York. The Spectre was forced to hold it up while the red mist got away, slaughtering dozens in the tunnels underneath the city to further empower itself against one so strong as the Spectre. Corrigan was forced to rescue the Spectre by finding him underground, and the spirit was freed while the building above was successfully evacuated, and the restored Spectre even managed to keep it intact. After much work, it was eventually discovered that the red mist was the ghost of a man named Enrique Armas. With the truth now in the open and the help of the phantom stranger, Gina and Enrique's spirits were able to peacefully move on. Corrigan was left to deal with this information, finding hollow comfort in learning the details of his death. Though he managed to once again avenge his own death in yet another reality and timeline, it turns out Swamp Thing was right about the results of the war between heaven and hell. Nothing would ever be simple again for this superhero. In New York City's Greenwich Village, at a popular show hosted by acclaimed mystic Zatanna, the powerful magician began gaining fame after her show delighted crowds night after night. One evening, however, Zatanna was alarmed when a trick led to her arm disappearing. Though the crowd was amazed, assuming this was a planned trick, this was not the case, and she was unable to return her limb with the normal spell. Instead, it summoned a portal, which in turn unleashed a series of beasts, a rainstorm of blood, and monsters, all onto the suddenly terrified crowd. With the show abruptly brought to an end, Zatanna sought out her assistant Adam for help, only to find him without a head, and for him in turn to turn to dust right before her eyes. 3 weeks later, at Madame Xanadu's home in Greenwich, a desperate Zatanna stumbled in with her missing arm returned, only for the other to have vanished. Explaining what had happened, with her now experiencing strange phenomenon going through all her limbs, the powerful superhero found herself at a loss as to what happened to her. The two discussed the last time Zatanna came into proximity with the Spectre, as she and her father Zatara were both involved with the battle against the darkness. Zatara died right before Zatanna's eyes in an effort to protect her from the shadow creature's magics. In the months that followed, Zatanna was tormented by her father's voice. She also learned that her mother belonged to a race of magical humans known as Homo Magi, and through this met Adam, leading to the events that happened at the show. Xanadu recommended Zatanna seek out the aid of Jim Corrigan, living upstairs of course, and summoned the detective to her chamber. On his way downstairs, when Jim Corrigan got distracted by his girlfriend, Kim, the Spectre grew impatient, and sensing the interesting energies brewing below them, he left Corrigan's body and abruptly went ahead. Learning what had happened, the Spectre decided to seek out Zatanna for himself, as he still possessed the power to communicate with the dead. Zatanna, meanwhile, suddenly had her arm return, only for her leg to disappear. The Spectre traveled into the afterlife, where he encountered the mysterious being known as the Phantom Stranger. This powerful entity informed the Spectre that Zatanna's spirit was not really there. Though the stranger assumed this was due to the man faking his own death, the Spectre confirmed that Zatanna's body was indeed destroyed, that Zatanna's soul must have been intercepted along the way into the afterlife. The Spectre agreed to look into this matter, and though the Phantom Stranger wanted to help, he had other business with a human named Bruce Gordon. It turns out this was all the work of a sorcerer named Wotan, who was trapped in the limbo realm connected to the afterlife after he attempted to capture the Spectre and the JSA years ago in the early days before Pearl Harbor. In the present day, Wotan had devised a plan to steal Zatanna's limbs one by one and drain them of mystical energy, creating a new body he could escape to on Earth. He returned the limbs each time he drained them to better stay hidden and avoid others discovering his plan, but still was nearly found by the Spectre when the spirit searched through the realms connected to the afterlife that could have stolen Zatanna's soul. Unfortunately, Wotan was able to remain hidden long enough for the Spectre to have to return to Corrigan's body. Meanwhile, on Earth, even though Pete Quarrel basically hated him, Jim managed to convince the police lieutenant to work with the private detective in looking into the missing limbs with old-fashioned police work while the Spectre was gone. They were able to trace a bizarre pattern of limbs appearing in the city along with a pair of demons who were secretly working on behalf of Wotan, and they followed a trail leading the investigators to a display at a local museum featuring an Egyptian artifact. There, the two were alarmed to discover Zatanna's missing limbs, discovering that Wotan was doing all this to construct his own new body on Earth. Conducting his magics from limbo, Wotan then seized Zatanna's torso, appearing before the men, while back at Xanadu's home, Zatanna began hearing the voice of her father, who commanded the young woman to seize the fortune-teller's torso for herself. Clearly affected by all this magic, Zatanna began to comply, just as the Spectre returned. Wotan's demons, Wrath and Ghast, grabbed the detective and Pete, while the Spectre redirected Zatanna's attacks by possessing the knives Zatanna had summoned. Pete and Jim then managed to fight the demons off, while Wotan fled, still vulnerable as his plans were not yet complete. Meanwhile, Zatanna continued her attack, summoning more weapons until the Spectre used his own arm to sub in for her torso, at the very least stunning the woman and returning Zatanna to her senses. Wotan, Wrath, and Ghast then turned their attention to their final missing piece, Zatanna's own head. Jim Corrigan returned, explaining what happened, and without a word the Spectre left, using this information to easily capture both Wrath and Ghast, and retrieve Wotan's body, still under construction. With all these new resources, the Spectre was able to mystically transport himself to Wotan's exact location. The spirit was able to reinforce Wotan's prison in Limbo, but Wotan then threatened to leave Zatanna in her broken state, while he also held Zatanna's soul hostage. The evil sorcerer revealed he was using Zatanna to plague Zatanna with visions, having also created Adam to further her torment and manipulate her even more, all to escape from Limbo. With no other choice, the Spectre made a deal with Wotan. In exchange for safe passage to Earth, Wotan would help the sorcerer restore the magicians. So Zatanna's soul was freed, Zatanna's body was restored, and Wotan was brought to Earth, though his demon minions were deliberately left behind by the Spectre in the now reinforced prison. The Spectre immediately tried to betray Wotan and attack him, but the powerful sorcerer was able to teleport himself away in a mere instant. With that, Zatanna was able to say goodbye to her father before the Spectre sent him to the afterlife proper. Later, when Jim Corrigan learned that the Spectre allowed Wotan to escape just to save two innocent souls, he couldn't help but wonder if he was starting to have an effect on his normally much colder and calculating spiritual partner. In an apparent response to Wotan's victory, the Spectre later approached Jim Corrigan, speaking in a very odd and disturbing tone. The ghostly being admitted he was struggling with this severe reduction in power, and concerning to Corrigan, the Spectre announced it decided it would seek out and slay murderers before they committed their crimes. Though concerned with the morality of it all, Corrigan later acknowledged to Kimmy he doesn't fully understand the power of the Spectre or the being that created him. Jim pointed out that he actually had come to prefer working as a private detective, even though nobody ever asked him if this is what he wanted. It all just sort of happened in the fallout of the crisis, almost as if reality or the presence knew this best reflected the person Corrigan had become in the wake of all those events. For a being as powerful as the Spectre, it was unlikely for him to actually be wrong about if someone was going to murder somebody, and he could very well save many lives, so Corrigan's instincts told him not to interfere. However, when the Spectre began putting this idea into practice, it began to affect Corrigan heavily. He decided to hide himself from the Spectre in response, and as they had been warned, Corrigan began wasting away without his partner, intent on finally bringing an end to the spirit for good, even if it meant his own death. The two eventually reunited, and Corrigan accused the Spectre of being as bad as the murderers he slaughters. They got in an argument about all of this, with Jim recalling an incident where he couldn't help a woman until after she was murdered, and that being a key reason as to why he no longer misses being a cop. So he could, to a degree, relate to the Spectre's perspective. But he also couldn't let go of the idea that the Spectre was messing around with the idea of free will and self-determination. And though it went unmentioned, the Spectre had been tricked many times before in the past, and could very well be manipulated into killing the wrong person. When prompted, Jim did agree with the Spectre that neither wanted to wait around for innocent people to be killed, but Jim insisted that they find real tangible proof of crimes before they act out on them. The Spectre simply insisted that at his level of power, his word was proof enough. On the verge of death, the detective felt as though this was as good of a detente as he was going to get, and decided to let the Spectre back in. This left things with the Spectre unconvinced fully by Corrigan, but he did stop rampaging through New York slaughtering would-be murderers without distinction, which Corrigan took as a victory of sorts. Yet in spite of what could vaguely be referred to as a win, Jim knew he couldn't pull off the trick again. Throughout the whole affair, Kimmy interfered to the point where she basically enabled the Spectre to return to Corrigan whether he liked it or not. And getting closer with the woman meant that he was less willing to sacrifice himself just to stop the Spectre. Meaning, if the Spectre ever got out of control, there wasn't much Corrigan was ready to do about it. So in spite of some progress, there remained a clear divide between Spectre and its host, one where, in theory, the fate of thousands hung in the balance. One day the Earth and many superheroes operating on it became involved in a massive attack organized by an ancient force of androids known as the Manhunters. They were seeking to defeat something called the Millennium Project. Though many superheroes were involved in facing the Manhunters from the start of this battle, including the Justice League International, Infinity Incorporated, and the Outsiders, the Spectre was initially uninvolved. This all changed when eventually one of the Manhunters' human operatives attacked Madame Xanadu's home. Knowing that the Spectre was associated with the people living in this building, the spy attacked Xanadu along with Jim Corrigan, demanding to learn more about the Spectre from them in the process. Jim barely managed to fight the stranger off and escape, so he, the Spectre, and Jim's girlfriend Kimmy all helped Madame Xanadu recover. The Spectre then used his magics to draw on the energies of the stranger that attacked their home, and determined that it came from the bayou of Louisiana. So he and Jim Corrigan promptly set out to investigate further. Traveling there, the Spectre could sense similar energies to those of the man who attacked Xanadu and Corrigan, and began to investigate the swamp on his own. Corrigan and Kimmy went to a nearby diner, hearing locals speak of strange lights and aliens nearby. Sure enough, the Spectre soon found the Manhunter base operating within the swampland. So he watched and observed these beings, noting they were artificial in nature, and determined he could thus possess them. However, doing so had a strange effect on him, essentially devouring the ghostly being's soul, as he became consumed by the collective hive mind of the Manhunters, hopping from one android body into the next as a result, not realizing he was destroying their machinery every time he did so. Meanwhile, investigating the strange phenomenon observed by the locals, Jim Corrigan ran into Batman, though their old friendship had been erased due to the crisis of Infinite Earths. Thus, treating him as a stranger, Jim and Kimmy briefed the Dark Knight on what they had learned so far about the area. Using this information, Corrigan and Batman worked together to infiltrate the Manhunter compound the Spectre discovered earlier, rescuing a number of hostages as a result, which they were able to easily do thanks to the Spectre inadvertently wreaking havoc with all the Manhunters in the area through his possession of the hive mind. The Spectre also, however, accidentally triggered an explosion of the base, while trapped within its sophisticated machinery. This nearly destroyed the Spectre, but he managed to escape back into normal space, at which point he returned to Earth. Arriving back on his home planet, he sensed strange energies brewing within the town of Smallville, and found the settlement completely deserted upon investigation. It was not difficult for the Spectre to find a nearby Manhunter ship that had landed, and all the townspeople had gathered around it, along with the legendary hero known as Superman. This was all part of a scheme concocted by one of the Manhunter's agents, Lana Lang, a childhood friend of Clark Kent. The Spectre offered to help Smallville, as all the town's children had been rendered comatose by a Manhunter in a strange attack that seemed to have somehow transported the android into the spirit world. Desperate to save them, Superman quickly agreed to a journey into the afterlife to rescue the innocent young humans, in spite of the tremendous risks that would be involved. Together, he and the Spectre were able to defeat the Manhunter and restore the souls of the children to their bodies, with the Spectre personally possessing the Manhunter and forcing the android to tear itself apart during their journey. After a short debrief where the Spectre mentioned these human infiltrators of the Manhunters like Lana Lang were forced into this role and had no memories of their part in all of this after the fact, Superman and the Spectre set out to continue this protracted battle. The Man of Steel regrouped with the other heroes to find them in awe of Batman and Jim Corrigan's heroism, but the Spectre's role in all of it escaped the notice of the other heroes. Jim Corrigan was happy to allow this adulation, as his identity as the Spectre or a famed police detective were no longer public knowledge within this group. The rest of the conflict and eventual defeat of the Manhunters continued without the involvement of either Corrigan or the Spectre, but both were very key in turning the initial tide against the invasion. Still, the Spectre did briefly confront a couple of vengeful souls towards the end of the Millennium incident. One thing learned in all of this was that humanity was destined to achieve great things in the future, essentially destined to achieve immortality and even the status of godhood. With that knowledge and the creation of new superheroes at the end of the Millennium event, reflecting that future direction, it was an exciting thing for many to think about, including the gathered group at Xanadu's home, though the Spectre was quick to warn his human companions that there would be much death and struggle in humanity's journey towards its destiny. The Spectre at this point seemed to rue its own immortality in the face of these events, realizing he would have to witness all this death and destruction before humanity reached this point himself, while hinting that at this time Jim was only destined for another 37 years of life with the Spectre, apparently aware that his host would eventually die while the Spectre would be forced to continue on without him. Later, the Spectre met with the Phantom Stranger, Dr. Fate, a villain named Gentleman Ghost, Madame Xanadu, Zatanna, and a handful of other mystically empowered superheroes like Deadman. The Phantom Stranger complimented the Spectre for his heroic actions in saving Zatara's soul and Zatanna's life, even if it meant freeing the evil sorcerer Wotan. However, the crux of the meeting concerned the news that humanity had a profound role in the future, and the immortals gathered there agreed to watch over and protect this race as they went through this transformation. The group agreed to this plan, but the meeting nearly fell to chaos when one of the attendees, a young magic user named the Enchantress, was possessed by a strange force and attacked the gathered party. The matter was easily resolved with so many beings of power gathered at one place, but it reiterated the need to bring some justice and order to a world that could easily fall under the sway of darker forces. Humanity had a great path before it, and it could not be corrupted. With all this in mind, Corrigan asked the Spectre if this would change anything between them, but to the Spirit, nothing was different. It would be 1,000 years before humanity's full evolution would be complete, and in the meantime, their role remained as it has always been. Though enough had happened, the Spectre was willing to admit to Corrigan he could have been wrong about his ideas of preemptively killing would-be murderers. Yet, Corrigan remained frustrated with his situation and seemed to be getting depressed. Around this time, as promised on their reunion, the Spectre was finally able to pass in and out of Jim Corrigan without causing the man any pain. Perhaps reflecting the mindset of Corrigan at the time, he couldn't help but be suspicious that the Spectre could have always chosen how much pain Corrigan experienced as the Spectre entered and left his body. During this, working off a tip from Madame Xanadu, the Spectre and Corrigan defeated an imp who took control of a man named Willie, and eventually used the man's body to create a larger vessel for the imp to possess. But the demon was quickly dispatched by the Spectre and trapped within an orb. In a related incident, the Spectre and Corrigan investigated an amulet found by a young boy that granted its user a pair of wings. The amulet took control of the young man, and it led to him nearly killing someone, and Jim had to step in to stop the Spectre from attacking the child. Insisting that the amulet had corrupted the boy, and that he otherwise would have been innocent, the Spectre argued to the contrary, pointing out that Corrigan himself was able to resist the effects of the amulet when he took it from the child. The two began to argue philosophy as a result, with Corrigan questioning whether the amulet would have corrupted himself eventually, and questioning who is to really blame if a young person supposedly turns to evil. The Spectre in turn argued these questions were beyond their power, and therefore they didn't need to worry about them. He was content to simply follow the role and rules given to him. But just the same, he was willing to simply return the amulet to Madame Xanadu and leave the child be. He did, however, warn Corrigan not to linger in the face of evil, whatever form it might take, and though Jim did save the child's life, he was left unsettled by the whole affair. When they returned home, things only got worse. The business surrounding the amulet and the orb were just a distraction, and Madame Xanadu was left trapped in a spell that had taken away her mouth and imprisoned her in a sarcophagus, while Kimmy had been brought into the orb that held the demon. The cult of the Blood-Red Moon, who had been secretly menacing the Spectre since his return to Earth, were now ready to strike. With no means to free Kimmy Lang from the crystal ball, and Madame Xanadu now completely incapacitated, the Spectre set out to investigate recent events for himself, alone. This put the Spectre in contact with a woman named Natalie, which the spirit saved from a serial killer named Gervais. During this, the group behind the attack on Xanadu's home and most of the supernatural events the Spectre faced since his return, the cult of the Blood-Red Moon, used the situation as a distraction to continue their plans of seizing as much mystical power and souls as they could manage. In order to defeat the cult, Corrigan and the Spectre were forced to travel within a possessed set of Madame Xanadu's tarot cards to exorcise the evil force within them. After a lengthy and surreal journey during which the Spectre and Jim Corrigan became a single, unified being, they confronted and met many figures of the tarot deck, and were able to exorcise the cards, freeing both Madame Xanadu and Kimmy Liang. The Spectre also was forced to confront something that had been brewing within the spirit for some time, a love and affection for Madame Xanadu, which he confessed to her in the real world upon their reunion. With this, it appeared the Spectre and Corrigan reached a new level of understanding and respect for one another they had never found before, and enjoyed a moment of peace and victory. With his friends restored, Jim Corrigan reached out to his old colleague Pete Coral, who once again reluctantly agreed to work with Corrigan in tracking down the cult of the Blood-Red Moon. Though Pete was still suspicious of Jim Corrigan, events surrounding Zatanna had been enough to at least convince the man that something odd was going on. But he still considered Corrigan dangerous. Jim decided the best way to prove his innocence was to show Pete the Spectre himself, who explained to the baffled officer the truth of the matter behind the events leading up to the cult's rise, such as what happened to Lou Petrocchi. He named off a number of other incidents he and Corrigan were involved in that the police were no doubt aware of, all to a shock to Pete Coral. Though this left Coral dumbfounded, he agreed to help the Spectre interrogate a cult member about the Blood-Red Moon, giving the two a lead on the group's current location at a lighthouse at a place called Point Rock. Traveling out there, Pete and Jim found the cult, waiting for the two. Assuming that Corrigan came without the Spectre, not realizing he and the spirit had a newfound trust in one another, the cult didn't initially view the detectives as a threat, instead preparing to devour the two men alive. Showing his newfound trust in the spirit, the Spectre emerged out of Corrigan and struck out. The spirit destroyed the demon that empowered the cult of the Blood-Red Moon, while the cultist fled on a plane. Unfortunately for them, the Spectre was able to give the aircraft chase, possess it, and destroy it, along with the cultists, once and for all. With that, the cult of the Blood Red Moon was destroyed, or at least the local New York chapter of it. Pete and Jim burned down the whole lighthouse, with Coral now perfectly aware nobody would believe an official report of these events. The police officer went so far as to admit Corrigan was clearly not evil, to offer the former police detective his sympathy. The Spectre next encountered the strange superhero and ghost-like being known as Deadman, assisting Deadman in saving an elderly woman from a werewolf. This being was created by a demonic entity forged in the depths of hell by Satan itself, who began to target and take an interest in the Spectre, viewing it and Corrigan as a threat to the demon's plans for Earth. Meanwhile, with the Spectre gone, Corrigan was helpless to resist an attack from another werewolf, who badly injured him, attacked Kimmy, and fled with Corrigan's dying body. When Kim later woke up, she informed Madame Xanadu and a visiting Deadman. Though Xanadu was unwilling to get involved herself, Boston Brand was not so reluctant, and possessed the powerful mystic, agreeing to use Xanadu's body to help Kimmy track down her boyfriend. They found and defeated the werewolf holding Jim, but this left the Spectre still missing. The attack on Corrigan had left the spirit weakened enough that the demon was able to lure the Spectre into a hotel room where the powerful being left the ghost to dissolve into nothing, trapped and separated from his host. And so Deadman freed Madame Xanadu, who was able to conduct a seance in order to locate the Spectre, and Deadman raced off to rescue him. These events, however, cost Madame Xanadu dearly, as it drained much of her power, though she willingly made this sacrifice due to her love for the Spectre, and the growing realization the demon they faced was intent on conquering all of Earth if they failed to stop it in time. Deadman managed to find the Spectre and restore him well enough that they could contact Kimmy, at which point her and Xanadu brought Corrigan's body to the hotel room, saving him and the Spectre. Now restored, Deadman and the Spectre emerged from Corrigan ready to confront the demon behind these events. The Spectre called this demon a proto-demon, as it was created and designed to be more powerful than the average denizen of Hell. Made from the bones of humanity's worst people in its history. Spectre healed Madame Xanadu as best he could, then left with Deadman, promising to help her more when he returned. This did, however, leave the Spectre in a weaker state than what was even normal for him in those days, leaving both him and Boston Brand uncertain of whether they could survive a battle against this proto-demon. They tracked it down and rescued a mysterious woman it had in captivity, and the two followed it into Hell. To battle the proto-demon, the Spectre possessed the very bones that were used to forge this being. They did battle, all while a possessed Jim Corrigan attacked Kimmy Liang on Earth. Fortunately, Corrigan was freed when the Spectre finally killed the proto-demon, saving the day, though even the Spectre was nearly corrupted by the evil of this realm. Sensing Satan's presence nearby, the Spectre fled with Deadman, wary of the effect the being would have on them. Satan, meanwhile, resurrected his child, commenting that suffering pain will be part of their growth, and that the proto-demon's training had just begun. On Earth, the spirits returned, with Boston Brand advising the Spectre to take care of himself, and to also go easy on his human companions. Not long after this, the Spectre saved Kimmy from yet another infestation of the monsters that hatched from the corrupted gumballs in Corrigan's apartment. He easily defeated these beings, saving her and the friends she had over, leaving to dispose of them, all the while Corrigan was away, enjoying a day off. Later, the Spectre helped Jim and Pete defeat a number of corrupt police officers, but Coral was left horrified at the Spectre's overwhelming power. When the Spectre revealed he manipulated both Corrigan and Coral into involving themselves in all of this, Pete turned on Corrigan, lashing out at what he was starting to consider his friend. Just as the NYPD arrived, Jim punched Pete, leading the police to attack, shooting Corrigan in the head. Though Pete, in a show of just how much he had come to respect Jim, and immediately regret the fight, despaired at the death of what he called a friend. Coral struggled to accept what he witnessed, but there was little anyone could do for the man, other than the Spectre, who tried to steal Corrigan's body away, though he was forced to set it down in a hallway when he was discovered by a nurse at the morgue. Jim's soul, meanwhile, was whisked off to the afterlife, where he was greeted by the Phantom Stranger. Bemused that this meant the certain end for the Spectre, Corrigan was glad to have finally stopped the ghost rampage, even after all they had just been through. The Spectre spoke to Xanadu, and they affirmed their love for each other. The spirit also offered his condolences to Kimmy, but promised both women he would try and restore Corrigan before he died, for the sake of his newfound love. Liang and the Spectre traveled to the morgue, where Kimmy met with Quarrel while the Spectre possessed Jim's body, meeting with him and the stranger in the afterlife. This led to a conflict between Corrigan and the Spectre, as Jim saw an opportunity to finally end his existence, while the Spectre desperately wanted to continue going on. Now, in the spiritual plane, they were on equal footing for the first time, and the two began to fight one another. In the end, the Spectre won over Corrigan, forcing Jim back to life once again. At first, no longer sensing the Spectre within him on Earth, Jim rejoiced at what he thought was his newfound freedom. He happily reunited with Kimmy and Pete, but before he could celebrate, suddenly, in front of the others, Jim Corrigan transformed into the Spectre. The two beings now shared a single body. In front of a baffled Kimmy Liang and Pete Quarrel, the Spectre confirmed that he and Corrigan were no longer separate beings, but instead now shared a single body, able to transform from the human Jim Corrigan to the ghostly being of the Spectre. The Spectre then reverted back to Corrigan, and the man could do little else but despair at his current situation, knowing that now the Spectre's mission would never end, while Jim seemed fated to forever be tied to this being. He lashed out at his friend and girlfriend, kicking them both out of the office. Corrigan then attempted to take his own life, but the Spectre forced Jim to cease any such behavior by partially taking over the man's body. In this half-transformed state, the Spectre insisted that Corrigan had no choice in any of this, and suggested the man move on. Madame Xanadu then sensed a new evil brewing outside, and called out to the Spectre. Corrigan was forced to endure the Spectre transforming their body into fog, and the spirit left to find this new threat. Kimmy returned as this happened to confront Corrigan over lashing out at her earlier, only to witness this alarming transformation while Jim cried out in pain. Outside, a woman was accosted by a strange man, who seemed to crave her blood. The Spectre saved her and attacked this man, only for him to surprisingly retaliate with lasers shot from his eyes. The energy from this attack was able to damage the Spectre, and the hero was forced to do battle with this mysterious stranger for some time. The man was remarkably resistant to the Spectre's attacks. When the Spectre reached within this stranger's body to rip out his heart, the man simply encouraged the spirit, and the Spectre only pulled out maggots and worms from this terrifying individual's body. The Spectre managed to break the man's neck, but he survived this too, seriously damaging the Spectre's hand in the process, and began crawling away in an attempt to make an escape. Suddenly, the Spectre began reverting back to human form. Recognizing the danger this strange man represented, the Spectre desperately tried to explain what had happened to Corrigan, and begged him to shoot the powerful individual in the head before it escaped. Corrigan, failing to understand the threat at hand, refused the request, so the Spectre, still partially in control, and even though he was injured, managed to take control of Jim's hand and shoot the man himself. With that, the Spectre was forced to transform back into Jim Corrigan completely, so he could heal his injury, at which point the police arrived. With Pete Quarrel now firmly understanding the nature of the Spectre, and with the testimony of the woman this stranger attacked, Quarrel is able to clear Corrigan of any potential charges from the police, as Jim clearly killed this man, named Kranich, in an act of self-defense, saving the woman Kranich assaulted in the process. With Corrigan's name cleared, he returned home, where Madame Xanadu introduced him to a man named Zoran, also called the Fisherman. Speaking cryptically, Zoran offered Corrigan the chance to go with him and face an evil threat together. Corrigan, for now, ignored this request and returned to his office, where Kimmy told Jim he had a total of 9 potential supernatural cases lined up for him, a surprising amount for their obscure detective agency that specializes in the occult. But Liang showed that Corrigan had appeared in a newspaper called the National Scoop that day. The paper had been covering him for some time and had taken an interest in his detective agency. Before he could contemplate the meaning of such events, a woman named Gina Sales arrived, introducing herself as a reporter for the Scoop, with a mission to turn Corrigan into a front-page star. Gina's behavior soon led to Corrigan's office being overwhelmed with calls concerning potential supernatural events, while Zoran still lingered, insisting he and Corrigan would need to work together to face the darkness around them. In response, rather than fighting the popularity, Jim apparently moved to accept it, asking Gina to put in a word out that he would be hiring more detectives. Though the Spectre was skeptical of all of this, Corrigan insisted it was a way for him to move past all their recent conflict in a more positive direction. This did, however, lead to the office being swarmed with many strange applicants. Yet in spite of this, Corrigan managed to find a new staff that seemed to make him happy. They consisted of Bug McGrew, a master infiltrator who had narcolepsy, Kim's roommate, Signer, a woman named Betty Bumpfus who had dubious claims of psychic abilities, Hassan al-Amarni, a man with a security background, and even Gina herself, who just got fired from the Scoop from getting too involved in Jim's affairs. However, just as Jim was about to celebrate the start of his new expanded detective agency, which he named Cryptica Crimes Limited, on the suggestion of Zoran, Kranich reappeared, shooting a powerful laser from his mouth, apparently returned from the dead. Corrigan managed to sneak away from the others and transform into the Spectre, and the two supernatural beings did battle in Jim's office. Once again, Kranich proved remarkably strong and resistant to injury, but the Spectre managed to possess the gargoyle perched over Madame Xanadu's home and used it to swallow Kranich whole, leaving the powerful foe entombed within the stone. Reverting back to the form of Jim Corrigan, he joined the others along with Zoran. Though Jim had been reluctant to accept the fisherman's help up until now, he now acknowledged the notion and need of having a partner to run this detective agency together, so he introduced Zoran to the rest of his employees as a partner in their now shared company. Their next client was a man named Roman Pike, who wanted to learn the identity of whomever killed his girlfriend, a woman named Jenny Dean. Corrigan put out a phone call to Pete and convinced his friend to allow Bug to do a preliminary investigation of the crime scene before the NYPD even had a chance to look. Jim then transformed into the Spectre, who traveled to the afterlife seeking answers, and once again he encountered the Phantom Stranger. The Spectre was directed to find Jenny's spirit in the deepest, darkest depths of the afterlife, which didn't surprise the Spectre, as both he and the Phantom Stranger were well aware that most humans are unworthy of reaching the light and salvation in the afterlife. The Spectre found Jenny's tortured soul, and she explained she was murdered by Roman. So the spirit returned to the mortal world and partially transformed back into Corrigan, explaining what he had learned. Though Corrigan tried to stop him, the Spectre attacked when Pike arrived at Jim's office, turning his own face into a terrifying visage, pursuing the man into the streets, turning into a giant, and chasing him down with a face so horrifying, Roman ultimately committed suicide. His body was discovered by Corrigan, who was devastated by this outcome, once again feeling the despair of his fate. In the days that followed, Jim and the entire detective agency traveled out to the Nevada desert to investigate a series of cattle mutilations at Zoran's request. While searching for clues, they set out to camp in the desert during the night, only for a car to be flung at the group. This did not help ease tension between the new team members, as the increased presence of supernatural events piling up around them began to disturb members of the group like Armando, who didn't, perhaps rightfully, trust Jim Corrigan. After all, the detective's new employees were unaware of his dual identity as the Spectre, let alone the fact that he now shared a body with this powerful ghost. Following the path of the destroyed vehicle's trajectory, the group found the remains of two government agents dressed in black. Both men had their flesh destroyed in a way that perplexingly left both their clothing and skeletons intact, apparently the result of some protective element in the black clothing that they wore. Zolan states his theory that these events are supernatural in nature, but they appear to be the work of aliens. Early testing of atomic weapons in the 1950s have appeared to have summoned some of demonic force. The group was chased off from the camp by a swarm of bats, leading them to a cave, and causing Corrigan to transform into the Spectre away from the attention of others. While a demon menaced the group, the Spectre returned his attention to a portal the creature had summoned, and voices calling to him from across the void. Abandoning Corrigan's colleagues, the Spectre went through the portal alone. Though Zolan was correct it was indeed a mystical threat, rather than an alien one affecting Nevada, little did he know the rest of the world was facing a considerable threat in the form of actual extraterrestrials. 9 alien races had banded together and carefully orchestrated an invasion of Earth, determined to destroy the rising population of the world's metahumans. Meanwhile, in the void, the Spectre could detect the arrival of this alien threat. Before he could do anything about it, however, he was summoned by the Lords of Order, powerful primordial beings that stand against the forces of chaos. The Lords forbade not only the Spectre, but all mystically empowered super beings on Earth from intervening in the invasion. Doing so would provoke the forces of chaos, which would escalate the war and put the Earth in cataclysmic danger. So for the sake of Earth, the Lords commanded the Spectre to stop the mystical superheroes from interfering with this invasion, at any cost. With this new direction in mind, the Spectre returned to Nevada, while in New York, Deadman reunited with Madame Xanadu, informing her that the Spectre ordered them both to travel out to the desert to join the hero at once. To get there, Boston possessed a pilot, and the two hijacked a plane. Within a sprawling complex of caves, Zoran the Fisher witnesses Bug being kidnapped by demonic beings, taking him through a portal to another realm. Nearby, 2 more government agents arrive, but the men in black are quickly killed by a demon. During this, the Spectre approached other heroes he called out to across the Earth, informing them they could do nothing about the extraterrestrial invasion, but could help fight the demonic force out in Nevada. With Dr. Fate, the Phantom Stranger, Zatanna, the demons Tala and Etrigan, along with the recently arrived Madame Xanadu and Boston Brand, the powerful wielders of magic traveled to the caves to do battle with the beings from another dimension. They were discovered by Armani, Siner, and Saran, who told them what had happened. The group put it to a vote whether or not they should rescue Bug or just seal the portal outright, with the Spectre voting that they save Bug after Jim's body briefly took over the Spectre to insist they do as much, considering Bug a friend and not wanting to sacrifice the man outright. The Spectre, Dr. Fate, the Phantom Stranger, Deadman, Zatanna, and Zoran all went through the portal to rescue Corrigan's colleague. The group eventually succeeded in finding Bug while also battling the beings from another dimension. They returned home, sealing the gateway behind them, while Etrigan and Tala slew all the demons still on Earth. The heroes were largely content with taking comfort in stopping at least one invasion of Earth, and were willing to put their trust in the other superheroes to stop the larger alien invasion. Deadman, however, refused to listen to the Spectre or the Lords of Order, and took off to involve himself in that conflict. In spite of the Spectre failing to stop Boston Brand and the explicit commands of the Lords of Order, in the end, Deadman proved a formidable foe against the alien invasion, and his involvement didn't seem to trigger any sort of cosmic repercussions in spite of the words of the Lords of Order. Eventually, the larger invasion of Earth was indeed repelled, and life began to return to normal. The staff of Cryptica Crimes all returned home, including Corrigan. On top of Madame Xanadu's home, in a half-transformed state, once again Jim spoke to the Spectre. Corrigan felt dismayed that the Spectre listened to beings like the Lords of Order readily, but Jim himself can't stop the spirit from doing anything. The Spectre in turn explained that he served a higher purpose and power, more sophisticated and complicated than Corrigan's sense of rationality or his feelings. Regardless, in this state, Jim didn't have a choice in the matter anyways, and seemed resigned to this fate. The Spectre, at this point in their lives, was in complete control, able to forcibly transform Corrigan's body into the Spectre at will, and take complete control over their shared form. Meanwhile, one of the many civilians who were affected by the alien invasion was discharged from a hospital. The man, named Richard Reddick, was one of many humans with a latent metahuman gene that was affected by the alien attack, even though Richard had no powers of his own. On his way out of the hospital, he was accosted by 2 strange men dressed in black. They told Richard they had a reason to think his life was in danger, and had the young man come with them. The men rushed off with Redditch, only for the vehicle to be ambushed by another group of men in red masks on the Triborough Bridge, who violently seized Richard and kidnapped the young man, while slaughtering the men in black. Elsewhere, Pete Quarrel noticed a body which appeared to have been killed in a way that suggested a new serial killer was active in New York City, just as a mysterious investigator arrived in pursuit of said killer. That investigator, who quietly checked into a rundown hotel, was a man named Jason Praxis, having been tracking the killer down across America for some time, with some in the press comparing this mysterious new slayer to Ted Bundy. Richard was taken to a scientist named Dr. Shockley, who led a team partnered with a man named Mr. Creech, a corporate representative for a secret group apparently called VTech, as they worked together in an attempt to turn Richard into a full-fledged metahuman, thanks to his latent gene, revealed in the process of him getting sick as a result of the alien invasion. While Creech saw the more obvious short-term profits in developing such techniques, Shockley had more ambitious ideas of developing a metagene activation technique which would give people customized powers and complete control over any emerging superhuman abilities. Back at Madame Xanadu's home, in light of his disappearance, Richard's wife Tara hired on Cryptica Crimes. She told them that Richard was acting strange even before the alien invasion, and was sure him vanishing had something to do with his metagene. So Jim had Bug and Armani look into the matter further. Nearby, Praxis briefed Quarrel on what he knew of this killer. This serial killer viewed himself as an artist who would speak to his victims even after he had murdered them, and had done this to at least 19 people so far. What's strange is the killer would often brag of his deeds to the press, but so far hadn't opted to do so in New York City. Back at the secret lab, the experiment got out of control, leading to a massive power surge felt across the city. The lab exploded, while elsewhere a young boy playing an arcade game was possessed by a strange energy at the same time. When Creech attempted to call for help, his walkie-talkie also exploded in an electrical surge. Richard emerged, his powers fully activated, and now possessing tremendous control over electricity and electronics. With these new abilities, he was easily able to escape captivity, killing 2 people on the way out. As for the young boy named Jamie, he promptly left the arcade, walking through New York City in a manner similar to Richard, and when confronted about his strange, listless behavior, Jamie responded by brutally killing a cat in front of some of his peers. The Spectre, who managed to split a piece of himself off to Corrigan to look into this, discovered and attacked Jamie, but stopped himself when he remembered what Corrigan said in defense of another innocent young man's life, and could see that something was wrong with Jamie. All too late, Shockley began to piece together what had happened. The experiment caused the metahuman gene to activate as dictated by the electricity and computers used to activate it in the first place. What Shockley and Creech failed to put together was a more sinister truth, that Richard was the serial killer Praxis was pursuing all along, and they just empowered this man to superhuman levels. Now able to transmit part of his mind across electrical systems, it was part of Richard that drove Jamie to mutilate and kill the cat. Redditch sensed his connection to Jamie and began transmitting orders. The Spectre informed Corrigan of what he experienced, and took hold of their shared body entirely, rushing off to learn more. Meanwhile, on orders from Richard, Jamie gathered a group of boys and exposed them all to Redditch's powers. Now possessed, the gang attacked a stranger, who was saved only by the Spectre's power, after many appendages burst forth from the dark superhero, knocking the gang of possessed children down in a swift and terrifying blow. Within the Spectre, Corrigan stopped the ghost from wiping out the gang entirely, pointing out something was clearly wrong with the children. So instead, the Spectre transformed back into Jim Corrigan's body, and Corrigan had some police detain Jamie and the others. The next day, Armani and Bug learned of Richard being taken by the Men in Black. This led Bug to recall a story he read in the paper of the same men being killed on the Triborough Bridge, and the two reported of this lead to Jim Corrigan. Because of this, Jim decided to call Pete Quarrel, who told him that the FBI were looking into the bridge incident, so he didn't know much. And Corrigan baited Pete into revealing that Richard appeared to still be alive, since the police didn't find an extra body among the Men in Black. Jim also realized that Redditch was probably kidnapped over his metahuman gene. Elsewhere, Richard hid away in a hotel room, while he possessed a punk and forced him to attack a stranger. He began exploring his powers, manipulating television broadcasts throughout the city. Realizing how strong he had become, Richard began making plans for bigger schemes. Sensing the spread of this power, Corrigan suddenly transformed into the Spectre, who set out to learn more in the city. With his new powers, Richard Redditch began using television in order to influence civilians into burning their own money, just for his amusement. Meanwhile, Madame Xanadu was approached by the Spectre, who commented that the ghost had kept his distance from her ever since he and Corrigan had merged into one body. They spoke of this new threat while nearby, Praxis and Quarrel discovered the body of the man killed by the punk possessed by Richard. When looking into the matter further, a police technician detected the presence of a virus created by Redditch that hampered their investigation. Richard then instigated a robbery by gathering a gang of minions he possessed with a part of his consciousness. As this mind-controlled group robbed an electronics store, the Spectre detected this and managed to travel through the electrical grid into the devices being stolen. He appeared before them in a distorted, wiry form, easily subduing those possessed, while leaving Richard shocked that there was something out there which could stop them. Perplexed, the Spectre transformed back into Corrigan's body and requested that the detective and his agency figure out what was going on. When the police found this gang, including the punk that had killed somebody, Praxis quickly deduced that this wasn't the real serial killer, and Quarrel began to think the real killer was somehow supernatural. Back in his hotel room, Redditch received a delivery of a computer and began a more deadly plan. In a single use of his powers on the internet, Richard was able to access the minds of nearly 1 million users in America, leading the serial killer to experience an unprecedented surge in power. Back in his office, Corrigan briefed Cryptica Crimes, though without Zoran, who had left on other business, and told them of the Spectre's existence. Though he was vague on the details, he confirmed to the detective agency that he had a connection to this ghostly being, as many of them had come to suspect. Jim explained how the Spectre encountered possessed people around the city, and they would have to pause their investigation into Redditch in order to look into this matter on the Spectre's behalf. Corrigan advocated to the group that they should help the Spectre at this time, reasoning that the ghost had helped everyone at Cryptica Crimes at some point by now, and they all owed him this favor. At that time, Pete Quarrel and Praxis arrived at the agency. Talking privately, Pete and Jim told each other what they had learned of recent events, and the Spectre began piecing things together. Everyone agreed to work together, and each set out on individual assignments looking for incidents in the area involving electricity. At which point Jim transformed into the Spectre, who had some ideas of his own of who he should look into. As for the near 1 million people attacked by Redditch, they all simultaneously fell into a comatose state. Later, Praxis explained to Pete how he once was a detective in Portland, before getting assigned to the serial killer eventually dubbed the Artist. When this killer, still not known to be Redditch by these men, attacked Praxis' niece, he began a relentless hunt for the Artist, resigning and pursuing the killer on his own terms. Hearing news of the mass comatose victims over the radio as he told this story, Praxis began to believe Pete when he said something unusual had happened to the Artist. As Cryptica Crimes looked into some of Redditch's early experiments with his new powers and investigated other leads, Redditch began refining his own powers further, killing a number of innocents brutally just to see how he could target specific people. After he meddled with a power transformer, the Spectre discovered this and had his spirit enter the electronic circuitry. Redditch immediately detected this, and so the Spectre was suddenly attacked by beings composed of electricity, created by this new metahuman. The Spectre used his powers to deduce these beings were the souls of those rendered comatose, captured by Redditch during his attack, and made into electronic constructs. Determined not to harm these innocent beings, the Spectre raced off, as he sensed the source of their power in Redditch, and moved to confront the man. Redditch could feel this happening, and managed to use his powers to block the Spectre, though the spirit was now able to tell where the metahuman was hiding. So the Spectre had Jim use his voice to contact Quarrel and request help at Richard's location. After doing so, Richard's army caught up with the Spectre, and once again they attacked. Coral and Praxis burst into the hotel room. The two men opened fire, killing Redditch's body. His soul, however, survived and managed to travel out into cyberspace, infecting the very man who was responsible for Richard getting his powers in the first place. Mr. Rand, Creech's superior and the one who wanted to develop the metahuman activation technique, became possessed with Richard's consciousness. Redditch immediately ended any VTech operations dedicated into finding Richard, and sensing this change, the Spectre left cyberspace and encountered Praxis and Coral in the real world, who were baffled by Richard's behavior. Turning back into Jim Corrigan, he quickly deduced the body belonged to Redditch and realized all the recent mysteries were connected. Meanwhile, Betty of Cryptica Crimes, who predicted much of this with her psychic abilities, volunteered to inform Richard's wife of the man's apparent death. The Spectre, however, warned Corrigan he could detect the danger was far from over. Somewhere out there, Richard's mind remained intact. However, with the mystery solved, the Spectre felt this was no longer a mortal affair, but required his powers alone. He went to Madame Xanadu and admitted that the creator of the Spectre, known as the Presence or the Voice, had not contacted him since he merged fully with Corrigan, and he required her guidance. Xanadu suggested this may have been because the Spectre was now mortal, or at least more than he had ever been. Fearing Redditch could provoke an apocalypse and that he couldn't stop the metahuman, they both desired to feel one another's touch as humans, at least once before the potential end. So the Spectre turned back into Corrigan, who kissed Xanadu on the ghost's behalf. Transforming back into the Spectre, they left, with the superhero stating that Xanadu was the only one he had ever felt any love for. Using Corrigan's voice, the Spectre warned Pete that things weren't over with Richard. The killer, meanwhile, consolidated his power, assassinating key members of VTech while directly tapping into the energies of the million people he had connected to throughout the internet. In an effort to combat this growing power, the Spectre figured out how to absorb the electricity himself. In cyberspace, the Ghost began a fierce battle against Richard's army, while in the real world, Richard, in Rand's body, after agonizing over the matter internally for some time, decided on one final plan to end all of human existence, and attempted to provoke a nuclear war with Russia, which he was easily able to do as VTech had deep ties with the American Department of Defense. In response, Rand's own men turned on him, realizing something was wrong with their boss, and they shot him dead. Once again, Richard's soul survived the attack, and he easily moved his consciousness onto the electrical grid. However, he left them unable to stop VTech's computers from continuing their new hacked protocol, and they began to take over American nuclear launch sites around the world. In the electrical grid, the Spectre finally encountered Richard directly, and learned that empowered by 1,000,000 souls, the serial killer was much stronger than the Spectre in this domain. In a display of force, Redditch began gathering more power from his collected souls. By doing so, he allowed the Spectre to seize some of that power for himself, giving the hero enough strength to overpower and defeat Richard. Redditch fled, leading to a desperate chase with the Spectre having only moments to stop a nuclear apocalypse. Richard went into the real world seeking out his old body, just as Praxis and Coral happened to be at the morgue as part of their investigation. In front of the baffled men, Richard emerged, resurrected. However, the Spectre was able to maintain an attack on his soul in cyberspace, while Praxis and Pete burned his body, and together they appeared to destroy Richard once and for all. With the metahuman finally defeated, the nuclear launches were aborted, though in the ensuing conflict, Praxis passed out. Luckily, the Spectre was able to discreetly turn back into Jim Corrigan and revive the investigator. Praxis woke and in front of the two men, reactivated the lights of the morgue, turned off in the earlier struggle. Though both noted the apparent activation of these new powers, much to the shock of Praxis, Coral reassured Corrigan that in his time working with this private detective, he learned the man was trustworthy, even if a little odd. In the days that followed, it was learned that most of the Department of Defense was unaware of the metahuman work being conducted at VTech. One surviving government official resigned in protest over everything. But otherwise, even though concerns were made about how the nuclear arsenal was controlled by a single computer network, little changes were made. Jamie and the other children possessed by Richard were let off lightly for their crimes, only assigned community service. Later, while Jim, who learned of the human experimentation conducted by Rand, compared the man to Oliver North, the Spectre asked why so many humans considered people like that heroic. Jim stated he did not know, but expressed disdain over the concept of flags. He believed the world was too small and fragile for more than one banner, leading to this distorted morality the Spectre didn't understand. The ghost took some comfort in the fact that Rand and just about everyone else responsible for Richard's rampage had died as a result of their own actions. Neither were aware of Praxis leaving town, possessed by Richard Redditch. In the time after events surrounding Richard Redditch, the Spectre found himself drawn to a small village in Eastern Europe, recently destroyed. He could sense something evil at play here, and encountered a being called the Grey Man, a servant of the powerful mystic beings known as the Lords of Order. The Spectre knew of this Grey Man, who removed the dream essence from those recently deceased, to deliver to his masters. This vital role was important in sustaining the power of the Lords of Order. Both the Grey Man and the Spectre could detect that this village represented the beginnings of a new challenge that would keep them both quite busy. Not long after this meeting, the American iteration of the Justice League was dispatched to investigate this village. As he witnessed the arrival of this team, the Spectre wondered what part he would play in these events. The Grey Man asked if the Spectre planned to fight on behalf of the Lords of Order, but, detecting the presence of Dr. Fate with the Justice League, the Spectre did not feel compelled to join the team as well, feeling that the Lords of Order were well represented here, and instead chose to watch only as an observer for the time. The Spectre focused his mind only on discerning why he felt compelled to be there to begin with, and he vowed to only act once he understood why that was. But once he did learn of this information, he promised to act with all the power under his command. The American chapter of the Justice League found their European chapter already operating in the village, and they were all attacked by the residents of this community who behaved in a strange way that resembled vampiric lore. In line with this, the attackers fled at the rise of dawn. The Spectre observed this with the Grey Man and later commented that things were far from over. He noted the Grey Man was content in filling the cosmic role consigned to him as a harvester of dreams, but the Spectre, having lost his connection with the Presence, was filled with doubt and confusion, and had been for some time. The day continued as the Justice League worked to discover what had happened to the village. Local troops confirmed only what the superheroes themselves had already seen, that the villagers appeared to have destroyed their own home, turned into something akin to vampires, and now they attacked the village every night. That evening, the Spectre prepared to watch yet another attack take place, only to be surprised to find the Grey Man disappeared. Dr. Fate approached the Spectre, suggesting that his arrival, as another agent of order, may have driven the Grey Man away, at least for a time. Fate could sense the Spectre's presence and wanted to reach out to him, with the Spectre explaining his compulsion to be here. Dr. Fate warned the Spectre that the nature of the Lords of Order were changing. They had given up their once eternal war against the Lords of Chaos, and though still involved in the affairs of man, it was now only for their own purposes. Upon learning this, the Spectre opened a portal, and had him and Dr. Fate travel to the Lords of Order so they could learn more. Watching from afar, the Grey Man emerged from the shadows, speaking out loud of his plan to destroy the Spectre and the Justice League, before then conquering the Earth. The Grey Man had begun working with a scientist from a large company called Stag Industries. The scientist had invented the means to control the minds of humans en masse through a biological agent, and together they raised an army which, due to the symptoms of the mind control properties, acted like vampires. Meanwhile, in a mystic realm, the Spectre and Dr. Fate realized, all too late, they had been tricked by the Grey Man. They spoke of this to the Lords of Order, but as Dr. Fate had said, things had changed. The Lords of Order announced this was the time of Kali Yuga, a new age of fire, madness, and destruction. The primordial forces of order had withdrawn their interest in the mortal realm as such, until such a time when they might be able to once again gain control over the universe. Though Dr. Fate protested, the Lords of Order simply commanded him to deal with the scientist and the Gray Man himself, and warped the superhero back to Earth. Now alone, the Spectre was given a choice for how he might want to continue with this new information. The hero chose to stand with Dr. Fate against the Gray Man, with or without the Lords of Order and their help. Back on Earth, things were getting out of control very quickly. The Gray Man turned on the scientist and managed to grow himself to a colossal size, killing his own minion before preparing to do the same to Dr. Fate. Fortunately, it was at that moment that Spectre returned to Earth, though not alone. Accompanied not only by the Lords of Order, but also the Lords of Chaos, the Spectre confronted the Gray Man, using a language and form of communication so beyond human comprehension that the witnessing Justice League couldn't understand a word that was uttered. During this celestial-level conversation, the Spectre explained that the Gray Man had gotten too greedy and gathered so much power he proved threatening to both primordial entities. With both lords now firmly aligned against the Gray Man, the greatest enemies in the universe set aside their differences to utterly decimate the Gray Man. The Spectre realized that this being was likely driven insane, as he was once a human and could not possibly fulfill the cosmic role consigned to him without eventually going mad. So he asked the Lords to show mercy on the being. They ignored this request, diminishing the Gray Man's powers so much that he was effectively lobotomized, doomed to continue mindlessly filling out his role of gathering dream essence for the Lords of Order from then on. With little else the Spectre could do, he left. Annoyed by this behavior, the Martian Manhunter noted he should have his government liaison, Maxwell Lord, look into the Spectre. However, unable to do anything about it at the moment, the superheroes like the Spectre returned home. There, the Spectre once again turned back into Jim Corrigan, who resumed his work with his detective agency. The staff of Cryptica Crimes gathered together to consider various cases, and settled on a supposedly haunted house in Pennsylvania. Corrigan tasked Betty Bumpus to look into this, knowing her psychic abilities would prove useful for this mission. He also had Bug and Armani look into Saran, who still hadn't returned. Steiner was told to remain on reserve for either party should they need assistance. Traveling out to Pennsylvania, Betty was startled to see within the haunted house a vision of herself, brutally killed, while the resident of the home, Angel Purvis, behaved oddly when she greeted her at the door. Betty met with the rest of the family, including Angel's mother and father, Robert and Barbara. They all had a strange way about them, and Bumpus was even more disturbed when the family had no reaction to a vase picking itself up off a shelf and flinging it at Betty's head. The family mentioned they were not a fan of this strange house or the weird events that happened around them, and they did try to move out a while ago, only to become very sick. It got so bad at one point they even went into a coma trying to escape the house. Robert was worried whatever was haunting them had also possessed his daughter. Betty was soon joined by fellow Cryptica Crimes investigator Gina, who also pretty quickly began experiencing disturbing phenomena, along with being attacked by a strange man and woman. When Gina screamed at her attackers, Betty rushed to her co-worker's aid, only to find nobody with the woman. Reporting all this to Corrigan, he quickly turned into the Spectre and raced off to help them. On his arrival, he quickly detected an evil energy penetrating the home. Within, the Spectre found a hidden plane of existence where he found a demon waiting for him. The demon had possessed Barbara's brother, a disturbed individual who Robert killed within the home years ago. The brother, named George, was burned in the house's furnace, and his spirit was both corrupted and possessed by the demon, and began tormenting the surviving family. The demon attacked the Spectre, pulling them both into the mortal realm through the body of Angel. With both the Spectre and Angel now possessed by the demon, they turned on Betty and Gina. Thinking fast and fighting possession of her own body by her alternate personality, Raka, Betty was able to pull herself and Gina into a pentagram, which the demon and his thralls were unable to pass. However, the Spectre was able to destroy the mystical seal quite quickly, which forced Gina to flee while the corrupted spirit sent Betty down a hole he created in the haunted house's basement. On the orders of the demon, the Spectre turned back into Jim Corrigan and began to hunt Gina down. After a prolonged chase that led everyone outside, including Betty, who managed to pull herself out of the hole, the possessed angel murdered her father as well as Betty. This snapped Corrigan out of the demon's control, and he turned back into the Spectre. In response, the demon emerged out of Angel's body and attacked the Spectre. After a short struggle, the Spectre managed to push this being into a fire, sending both the demon and George's corrupted soul to hell. Corrigan, however, was left dismayed to learn that Betty had not only been killed, but her soul had also been pulled into hell too. He begged the Spectre to go after her, but the spirit simply didn't want to. It explained that hell was part of the natural order of things, and it was not his place to go there. Last time he went to a hell domain, it was a deeply unpleasant and unsettling experience. The spirit couldn't stay very long, or else he could have very well become corrupted, turning into one of the most powerful weapons of hell. So the spirit left Jim to dwell on this, but with no other means to save Betty, all they could do was effectively rue the fact the woman was essentially doomed. And then the series was suddenly cancelled.